As the seeker begins to observe the movements of the external nature closely, he can identify certain repetitive patterns of response, including impulses to stimuli of various sorts, cravings, desires, fears, frustrations, anger, and attraction. All of these are for the most part virtually automatic without conscious decision or control by the higher elements of the being. While we tend to think of ourselves as being in control of our life responses, the reality tends to be far different than our superficial assessment. We call these movements instincts, habits, or trained behavior. Trained behavior is essentially an embedded memory that calls for a specific response. Each of these needs to be resolved somewhat differently. Instincts tend to be the most deeply embedded elements which harken back to an evolutionary development that may be far in the distant past of the species, or indeed of the animal or plant kingdom more generally. Instincts are thus not simply overturned with the application of a mental will or some kind of affirmation. They can be partially controlled through an exercise of will, but their force of expression remains and can easily overcome the willpower in most instances. Changing an instinct thus requires application of a new evolutionary power to intervene in the process, and can thus only come about when the subconscient is flooded with the spiritual light and force, and thus takes on an entirely different vibratory pattern. A small example of an instinctive response and a change occurred some years ago when some people attended an anti-war protest in Washington, D.C. They were surrounded by heavily armed and armored police, and a general instinctive response of fear entered the people thus surrounded. Then an individual began to chant Om loudly, and this was picked up by others, and soon the entire group was responding, and the fear element was removed by this higher vibratory pattern. It is thus possible to overcome even instinctive behavior under certain conditions. Making this a more permanent and automatic response, of course, is a different matter requiring substantial and persistent efforts to bring the higher light into the densest and darkest regions of the being. Habits are somewhat more easily controlled. Habits are made through repetitive behavior. While the behavior may begin as something of an automatic response to a sensation, feeling, impulse, or perception, it does not become a habit in the first instance. It is through a repetition, in many cases involving a conscious decision, that a habit builds up and creates what many call grooves in the nature that smooth the flow of energy in the direction that has been turned into a habit. A habit that has been made can be unmade through patient and persistent steps to counteract it when it arises. This includes things like various forms of craving, or even behaviors of frustration or excitement under various provocative circumstances. We sometimes see professional tennis players become upset with their play or the umpire's calls and throw their tennis racket out of frustration. This is actually an expression of an habitual pattern they have likely developed during the training period. Just as habits can create negative vital responses, habits can also be made through pattern and reward processes that can aid the being. Replacement of one deleterious habit by a more positive habit can interrupt the old habit. Of course, the new habit will eventually need to be addressed, but this can be seen as a progressive process over time. One example of this is to replace negative thoughts with positive affirmations, chants, mantras, etc. Trained responses are the most superficial of the elements that influence the subconscient, in that they are built through a very detailed process of repetition, in many cases through a designed program. Much of the educational activity that takes place in schools or in military training represents the systematic development of trained responses. An awakened seeker can begin to recognize these trained responses and undertake to adjust, modify, or eliminate them through a counter-training. In some cases, such as those that involve involuntary muscle tightening, various practices such as meditation, hatha yoga, martial arts, or biofeedback training can work on these elements. In the end, the power of light entering the mind and will and exposing this subconscient layer and its mechanisms, then entering the vital being and working on opening the emotions and the vital responses, and finally changing the very vibrational patterns of the physical being, is the tool needed to be patiently and persistently applied to the subconscious. Understanding the mechanisms at work and the relative type of subconscient behavior being addressed can aid in this process if the practitioner exercises calm, steady, and persistent will towards the needed opening and change. Sri Aurobindo notes, quote, "The subconscient is a thing of habits and memories and repeats persistently or whenever it can old suppressed reactions, reflexes, mental, vital, or physical responses. It must be trained by a still more persistent insistence of the higher parts of the being to give up its old responses and take on the new and true ones." End quote. Reference, Sri Aurobindo, Bases of Yoga, Chapter 5, Physical Consciousness, Subconscient, Sleep and Dream, Illness, pages 90 to 91.